in the year 1627, while the Pilgrims were still trying to survive their first winters in a place called Plymouth. Something was born in the freezing black water off the coast of Greenland. It had no name. No one saw it happen. There were no witnesses, because at that depth, in that cold, there is no light and there is almost no life. That creature is still alive today. It has been alive through the entire history of the United States. It was already over 100 years old when George Washington was born. It was swimming through the same stretch of Arctic Ocean, while World War I and World War II were fought on the surface of the planet above it, completely unaware, completely unaffected, just drifting, slowly, through the dark. And here's the part that should genuinely unsettle you. Scientists didn't figure this out until very recently, and when they did the math properly, they realized something else, something that changes how we should think about almost every ancient creature living in our oceans right now. These animals aren't just old. They are living archives. They are storing something inside their bodies that we put there, and the deeper researchers dig into these creatures, the more it looks like we've been dangerously wrong about how fragile and how contaminated they actually are. By the end of this video, you're going to understand exactly how a shark can live for 400 years, how scientists actually proved it, why some of the oldest animals on Earth might be walking, or rather drifting, time bombs, and why the thing that makes these creatures so remarkable is the exact same thing that's putting them at risk of disappearing forever, faster than almost any other animal on the planet. Let's start with the shark, because the story of how we found out its age is almost as wild as the age itself. The animal in question is called the Greenland shark. It's a slow, blunt-nosed, ghost grey giant that can grow past 20 feet long and weigh over a ton. For most of scientific history, nobody had any real idea how old these things could get. And that's not because scientists weren't trying. It's because the usual method for aging a shark doesn't work on this one. Normally, if you want to age a shark, you look at its vertebrae. Sharks lay down growth rings in their spine, kind of like tree rings, and you can count them to get a rough age. But Greenland sharks have soft, cartilaginous vertebrae that don't preserve those rings cleanly. So for decades, the age of this species was basically a guess, built off how slowly they seem to grow, less than half an inch a year, and how enormous some of them get. Then a team of researchers had an idea that sounds almost too clever to be real. Instead of looking at the spine, they looked at the eyes. Inside the lens of a shark's eye, there are proteins that form before the animal is even born, while it's still developing. And here's the key detail: those proteins never get replaced, ever. Once they form, they are metabolically frozen in time for the rest of that animal's life. They don't regenerate. They don't break down and rebuild like most tissue in your body does. They're locked in exactly as they were on the day they formed, which means if you can figure out when those specific proteins were created, you can figure out when that animal was born. And we actually have a way to do that. Because of nuclear weapons testing in the 1950s, atomic bomb tests released a massive pulse of radioactive carbon into the atmosphere, and that carbon spread through the entire planet, including the ocean, including the tissue of every living thing in it. So scientists can measure the exact radiocarbon signature in that frozen eye protein and compare it to the known historical timeline of atmospheric carbon. It's like a fingerprint stamped with a date. So a team of researchers gathered up 28 Greenland sharks, all female, all caught accidentally as bycatch by fishing boats, meaning nobody went hunting for them. They just ended up tangled in nets meant for something else. The scientists took the eye lenses, ran the radiocarbon dating, and started crunching numbers. The results, published in the journal Science, were almost hard to believe. The largest shark in the group, a 16-foot female, came back with an estimated age between 272 and 512 years old. The central estimate landed around 392 years. Let that sit for a second. Even the low end of that range, 272 years, is enough to make this the longest-lived vertebrate ever confirmed on planet Earth. Not close, not up there with the actual record holder by a huge margin. Now here's where the story stops being a cool fact and starts becoming something heavier. Because age wasn't the only thing this research revealed. The same data let scientists estimate something just as important. When these sharks actually become capable of reproducing. And the number that came back was staggering. Greenland sharks don't reach sexual maturity until they're around 150 years old. Think about what that actually means for the species. A shark that gets accidentally caught in a fishing net at 90 years old, an age most humans will never reach, hasn't even had the chance to reproduce yet. It's not an adult in reproductive terms. It's still, biologically speaking, a teenager. Every mature female that dies as bycatch represents a reproductive loss the population has almost no ability to recover from on any timescale that matters to us. We're not talking about a species that bounces back in a decade or two. We're talking about population recovery measured in centuries, and Greenland sharks aren't caught rarely. Around 3,500 of them end up as bycatch every single year in Arctic and Atlantic fisheries. Nobody's targeting them specifically anymore. The historical liver oil hunting industry died out decades ago, but they're still getting pulled up, tangled, and killed as a side effect of fishing for something else, at a scale that a slow-breeding, centuries-maturing species simply cannot absorb. So already this animal's biology alone should worry us, but it gets worse, because there's a second layer to this story that almost nobody talks about, and it applies to more than just sharks. These ancient, slow metabolism deep-sea creatures aren't just old, they're also chemical sponges, and not in a good way. Here's the mechanism. Mercury, mostly released from coal burning and gold mining, gets pumped into the atmosphere, drifts around the planet for roughly a year, and then eventually settles into the ocean. Once it's in the ocean, though, it doesn't just wash away or break down quickly. It can persist there for over 300 years. Microorganisms convert it into a more dangerous form called methylmercury, which is the version that actually gets absorbed into living tissue. And it doesn't just sit still, it bioaccumulates, meaning it builds up more and more inside an animal's body the longer that animal lives, and it biomagnifies, meaning it gets more concentrated as you move up the food chain, from small fish to bigger fish to apex predators. Now put those two facts together. You have an ocean where legacy pollution from 1.5 centuries of industrial activity is still actively cycling through deep water currents. And you have a predator that lives for centuries, has an extremely slow metabolism, sits near the top of the Arctic food chain, and doesn't excrete or break down toxins quickly because, well, almost nothing about its biology moves quickly. That's not a coincidence. That's a perfect recipe for an animal to become a living reservoir of every toxic compound humans have released into the ocean since the Industrial Revolution. Researchers studying Arctic wildlife have found that even though global mercury emissions have been declining since the 1970s, mercury levels in Arctic animals are still going up, not down, because so much legacy pollution is trapped in deep ocean currents that are only now delivering it to these ecosystems. The pollution we caused generations ago hasn't finished arriving yet. For a creature like the Greenland shark, that means an animal born in the 1600s has been marinating, quite literally, in centuries of accumulating industrial contamination, and the exposure isn't slowing down, it's compounding. So we have a species that takes 1.5 centuries just to become capable of reproducing. That's already being killed off faster than it can replace itself through accidental fishing bycatch, and that's simultaneously accumulating rising levels of toxic heavy metals throughout its extraordinarily long lifespan. When researchers put all of that together, the picture that emerges isn't, wow, ancient sharks are cool. We may be looking at one of the most quietly vulnerable large animals on the planet. And we only just found out how vulnerable, because we only just found out how old and how slow it actually is. But the Greenland shark isn't alone in this story. It's just the most dramatic example of a much bigger pattern happening across the ocean's oldest inhabitants. Take the ocean quahog, a species of clam found in the North Atlantic. In 2006, researchers dredged one up off the coast of Iceland that turned out to be 507 years old. born around the year 1499, back when the Ming dynasty ruled China, which is actually where its nickname came from. Scientists nicknamed it Ming. It had survived the entire span of recorded American history, survived world wars, survived the Industrial Revolution, survived the birth of the internet, sitting quietly on the ocean floor the entire time, in a detail that the researchers themselves later said they deeply regretted. They froze it to study it and killed the oldest known individual animal on Earth in the process of trying to understand it. Ocean quahogs, like Greenland sharks, exhibit something biologists call negligible senescence, meaning they don't really show typical signs of aging as they get older. Their bodies don't visibly deteriorate the way most animals, including us, deteriorate with time. They just keep functioning, generation after generation of humans passing by overhead, while the clam sits there largely unchanged. Then there's an even more extreme case, a species of glass sponge called Monohaphis chuni, which lives more than 2,000 meters underwater. Individual specimens are estimated to live for up to 11,000 years. 11,000 years. That's older than written language. That's older than agriculture in most parts of the world. There are sponges alive today, right now, that were already ancient before the pyramids were built, and they're just sitting quietly in total darkness, filtering the same water, more or less unchanged, since before humans invented the wheel. And deep-sea black coral colonies have been dated at over 4,000 years old, meaning some of the coral structures currently living on our ocean floors were already growing when the Great Pyramid of Giza was under construction. Here's what all of these animals have in common, and it's the thread that ties this entire story together. They share the same basic survival strategy: slow metabolism, minimal movement, cold or deep environments, and biological processes that essentially run in extreme slow motion compared to almost everything else alive. That strategy is exactly what let them survive for centuries or millennia in the first place. But it's also exactly what makes them so slow to reproduce, so slow to recover from population loss, and so efficient at soaking up and holding on to whatever toxic material happens to drift past them over that unbelievably long lifespan. In other words, the very trait that made these creatures biological marvels, that incredible, almost unbelievable longevity, is the same trait that makes them uniquely defenseless against a species that didn't exist for almost their entire lifespan: us. Now, it's not all grim news, and this part actually matters, because it's reshaping entire fields of medical research. Scientists studying the Greenland shark's genome have found something remarkable: a gene toolkit for repairing DNA damage that appears to be unusually robust compared to shorter-lived species. They found unique mutations in a protein involved in stabilizing chromosomes, the structures that hold DNA together, that may help explain how this animal avoids the kind of cellular decay that eventually kills the rest of us. Researchers have also studied the Greenland shark's heart tissue directly, comparing it to short-lived fish species, and found that the shark's heart does show typical signs of aging, things like scarring and oxidative stress, the same wear and tear you'd expect in any old heart. But remarkably, that aging doesn't seem to actually limit the animal's lifespan. Its body appears to compensate for the damage well enough to keep functioning anyway, for centuries. That finding alone has researchers in the field of human aging paying very close attention, because if we can understand how a heart tolerates 4 centuries of wear without failing, that knowledge doesn't just stay in marine biology journals. It potentially feeds into how we understand human cardiovascular aging too. There's also a study that found something almost poetic. Scientists had long assumed these sharks were essentially blind, since they're frequently found with parasites attached to their eyes, and they live in permanent darkness anyway, so why would vision even matter? But new research published in Nature Communications found that Greenland sharks maintain fully functional vision, well adapted to extreme low light, with no meaningful retinal degeneration, even in animals estimated to be 2 centuries old. For comparison, a human eye that old would have lost the vast majority of its light-sensing cells. This shark's eyes just don't seem to get the memo. that they're supposed to be failing. So here's where all of this leaves us. We are looking at animals that have cracked some of biology's hardest problems: how to resist cancer, how to repair DNA damage over centuries, how to keep organs functioning well past any timeline evolution seems to have designed for, at least based on how the rest of the animal kingdom operates. These creatures are living proof that the biological rules we assume are fixed, rules about aging, about decay, about how long a heart or an eye is supposed to last, are not nearly as fixed as we thought. But we are also looking at animals that take longer to reach adulthood than most human family lineages last. Animals that are dying by the thousands every year as accidental bycatch before they've ever gotten the chance to reproduce, and animals that are quietly accumulating the chemical fallout of the last century and a half of human industry inside their own bodies, with no biological mechanism built to handle a threat that fast and that new. That's the uncomfortable core of this whole story. We just discovered how genuinely extraordinary these creatures are. At almost the exact same moment, we discovered how badly we may have already been damaging them. The Greenland shark spent nearly 400 years surviving in one of the harshest, most unforgiving environments on Earth, completely undisturbed. It took us less than 2 centuries of industrial activity to become one of the biggest threats it has ever faced. And because we only just found out how old, how slow, and how vulnerable these animals really are, we're only just beginning to understand how much we might already stand to lose. Somewhere in the North Atlantic right now, there is a shark alive today that was already swimming through that cold, dark water before anyone in your family tree had ever set foot on this continent. It doesn't know what a fishing net is supposed to mean for its species. It doesn't know what mercury is. It's just doing what it's done for nearly 400 years, drifting slowly, quietly through the deep. The only real question left is whether we figure out how to let it keep doing that for another 400 more.